be the background story.
Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today is the first day I'm going to launch this project I've been thinking about for many years. I'm actually speaking on the trail, the main trail, aside from the main trail, coming up Stone Mountain. I've been trying to walk up once a week, and right now I'm looking out over parts of Atlanta, Georgia, in Midtown, and I can see Kennesaw Mountain from here. Of course, many trees and lots of people, lots of different people walk up and down this mountain. It's really kind of glorious to be with people who speak many languages, people who come from many nations even. There's a nearby immigrant community, and so there are a lot of young children climbing up with all different kinds of clothing with their parents, and all different ages, shapes, sizes. It's just glorious. You should come and visit sometime. Climb up yourself. Anyway, I have decided to launch this podcast today just to sort of announce that I'm going to try to do this once a week too, and try to make some videos that hopefully will help dispel some myths about therapy and engage people in conversations. We're at a critical time in our country right now where we're trying to come out of a pandemic, but we're also trying to understand what we've just been through with all the racial division and spiritual warfare, and all the emotions as humans we all can feel and do feel. And how do we deal with those emotions? So I decided to do this today because on this date in 1981, I was still in high school then, Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman passed away and left this planet, this earthly realm. But he left behind some amazing material. I got to go to a conference this past week at Emory, where scholars and storytellers and activists and people of faith and heart and hope gathered to celebrate the life and work of Howard Thurman. I got to even meet his grandson and his great-grandson and speak to them. It was just amazing experience. And of course, Dr. Luther Smith, who is one of my mentors, was there and instrumental in pulling this off, as were many other scholars. Of course, Dr. Walter Fluker, who is in charge of all of the archives at Boston University, Morehouse, and Emory. And the legacy of Howard Thurman is really important for us to dive into and think about, because he was a deep thinker, a spiritual leader, and is not as well known as others of his day, but beginning to be well known. He recorded all his sermons. He was the first person to ever pull together a group of people from all nations to worship together out in San Francisco, California. I think it was in the 40s. And his grandson actually is, his father's Asian and his mother is African American, and so he wouldn't even, I joked with him, I said, you wouldn't even be here, would you, if your grandfather hadn't started the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples in San Francisco. And he chuckled and laughed. It was a very pleasant day and experience to be with Howard Thurman scholars and interested people of heart and mind and soul. If you don't read anything else, get this book, Jesus and the Disinherited, with a plane overhead, and begin to acquaint yourself with a new understanding of Jesus of Nazareth, who is quite different from the Jesus that is often celebrated and worshipped. Today is Palm Sunday, and I'm looking out over all these pine trees, and to me it's Pine Sunday down below all the pine trees here. But I want us to, as we're beginning to open up and experience new life, I want us to examine our hearts and minds and not condemn ourselves for our emotions, but train our emotions I mean, if you're a spiritual person, a religious person, a Christian, a Jew, a Buddhist, a Muslim, you know, we've had many leaders throughout the history of the earth, and the best of all of our religious and spiritual leaders are of a similar mind in the end when they're trying to help us train our affective qualities and be united rather than divided. So I just want to say I'm going to make these videos short once a week, and I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to try to offer some content below, and this will be a weekly offering, and hopefully I can develop some courses and some group therapy experiences as I go along, and I've been doing that anyway during the pandemic. And I want to launch it in some new ways, more closely aligned with Howard Thurman, especially because he has a lot to say to us today. So I would invite you to not be afraid to learn, not be afraid to change your mind, not be embarrassed to say, I don't know this, because I'm going to say a lot of what I don't know. And I hope you'll join me, and I hope you will write below in the comments an answer to this question. And the next video I'm going to share, I'm going to get up on the top of the mountain and make that one, is an example of the kind of storytelling that I think matters. I think I'm going to call this YouTube channel More to the Story, because there's always more to the story. And the question that I've been thinking about today, because yesterday was the day when the funeral service was held for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1968, April the 9th, 1968. Today's the 10th. Is that right? Anyway, is when did you first begin, here's the question, when did you first begin to notice difference? And was that a traumatic experience, or was that a revelation? It could have been traumatic and revelatory, but sometimes revelation can come as a blessing. So what I want you to understand or get in touch with is what is your first origin, what is your origin story for noticing difference? And were you okay? How did you interpret that? I'm going to tell a story myself, and hopefully that'll be something that'll serve as a model for you to tell me some stories too. There's always more to the story. Yesterday's conference about Howard Thurman had to do with one of his last books. It might have been his very last book, where he was talking about the search for the common ground. And Stone Mountain, Georgia, has a link with the Confederacy in a past that was really sadly and devastatingly connected to the KKK. But now you can see every race, every religion, probably every nation walk up here, and the common ground we have is actually trying to get up this tall mountain. I don't know if you can see. That's our common ground, trying to get all the way up to the top of this mountain. Off in the distance you can see Atlanta. I'm going to try to video here. Maybe too much background noise. But difference. The first time I remember experiencing difference actually came as a flashback memory to me after January the 6th, when people stormed the Capitol, fueled by all kinds of fear and anger and whatever else they were feeling, threat, insecurity. Anyway, you know, there were lots of comments about, had that been a group of mostly black people, there would be gunfire, terror, but there was none of that happening on January the 6th. It was mostly white people. It was horrifying, terrifying. Hang my head, somebody said. I literally could not take it anymore, and I shut down the television. And I couldn't I developed almost a hysterical formation symptom where I couldn't stand the sound of the human voice on the TV. So, if it wasn't for the Olympics, I probably would still be sitting in silence in my house. But because that pulled me out of it. But during those 7 months of silence, I did all my Zoom therapy clients, but I started listening to the sermons and the lectures of Howard Thurman and really trying to heal my spirit and align with a new way of commitment to love, which is not an easy thing to do. So I'll say more about that later, but the question I posed, which I'd like to hear some stories from you about, is when did you first notice difference? What happened for me during the month of April in 1968 when my mother sent my sister and I to be with my grandparents in Greenwood, Mississippi. My mother and father were in Tennessee, where my dad was a family practice physician in a small coal mining town, a ridge over from where he grew up in Appalachia. My mother from the Delta, Mississippi Delta, was a psychiatric nurse. Had 2 kids by then, but was getting ready to have our brother. And she sent us to Mississippi, and we stayed for a month. My sister and I were in a daycare center because my grandmother was working in a bank. She couldn't take care of us. And I was, I guess, too worried about my sister because they were making her take naps and she didn't really want to take. She was always very energetic. So I was looking out for her, doing what big sisters do, and kind of pestering the caregiver. So I think they kicked me out, actually. But one of my grandmother's friends, who's a nurse in the Greenwood Hospital there, had a friend, a black nurse friend, and they had her take me on. This was at the beginning of April. It was a very contentious, horrible month for race relations. That's when Dr. King was killed. And for some reason, I was under the care of Miss Rosie. And she took me with her everywhere, all over Greenwood. I have memories of flashbacks during this silent 7 months. I had flashbacks of being, I think, in Baptist-town, which is a part of Greenwood. It's a historically black community. Because the houses that I was able to find on the internet looked similar to what I had in my memory. And the first time I remember noticing difference, ironically, was when I was standing in this community shopping area. And there were a lot of picketing and protests that were happening in Greenwood during that month as well. And right before Dr. King was shot. And I remember looking through the fence and seeing a swimming pool full of children. And they were all black children. And I could see the water droplets sparkling and shining like diamonds off their skin. And that's the first time I noticed difference. And I must have been standing with Miss Rosie and some of her friends, and I remember hearing, "Why is she here?" in a dialect that was not familiar to me. But I was able to understand it enough to know that they were talking about me. And now I understand a little more about how odd and treacherous it must have been to have a little white girl to take care of during that time. So Miss Rosie gave me some money, and I went into the grocery store to get some juicy fruit chewing gum. And I remember walking into the grocery store and everybody, all the adults, stopping, just freezing, to coming to a standstill while I was walking around. And as a 5-year-old, I remember thinking, wow, they really like me, which is, I guess, white privilege, right? Now that I think about it, being 50-something, I realized that they were afraid that it was a setup for terror. So everybody stopped in their steps so no harm would come to me, which is just kind of gross when I think about it now. But anyway, I got the gum and I put it on the register. I remember reaching up above my head to put the change on the counter there. And I remember a man, the woman that took my money it must not have been enough. And the woman that was taking my money was kind of very still and didn't respond to me. She didn't say that's not enough. She didn't scold me or anything like that. She's just very still. And I heard this gentle voice of a man and whispered tones say, "I'll pay for it." And they got me out of there. So I that's a scene that I had flashbacks to all my life. And then I remember watching the funeral with Miss Rosie. And I think she and I were alone in my grandmother's house, but I also remember being in her house with her children. But we weren't watching the funeral together. And Miss Rosie, you've seen the iconic picture of little Bernice, who's the same age as me, in her mother's lap. And in my memory, I remember hearing Dr. King's voice too and thinking, well, where's her daddy? So I guess I'm assuming that she was also hearing his voice and maybe in her look up to her mother, wondering, where's my daddy? And I remember Miss Rosie saying, you see that little girl right there? She's just like you. So I don't think I actually noticed the difference in race ever before, really, even though Miss Rosie was trying to teach me different lessons, which I won't go into right now. She kept saying, I'm not your babysitter, I'm your friend. So she really wanted me to get that seared in my mind. She was not a domestic worker, she was a nurse. And she took me into the hospital to visit her patients. Now I think maybe it was even her husband. I'm not sure. I've tried to search her and find her. I hope somebody sees this video and helps me understand who that might have been. I'd love to meet the children if they're still alive and talk to them. Anyway, that was a sad, treacherous day and time, and I was protected from it in ways that Miss Rosie and black people and all across the country were not. And as a 5-year-old, I don't have a memory of the sadness. I have a memory of being curious as to why he died. I'm still curious about that, actually. The 5-year-old in me rises up and wants to join hands with Bernice and say, why? Where have we gone from there? So that's my story of my first recognition of difference. And I don't want us to be afraid to have these conversations because they're still fueling so much of our conflict and the divides that we experience. And racism and slavery, the history of slavery in this country, and terrorizing and torture and violence and rage unchecked. We've got to do some work to get those conversations happening in some real ways that make a difference now.